Hello, everybody, and welcome to this, which is the 36th consecutive fireside. Not much of a fireside, I have to say. Great minds, certainly true. Great lives, certainly true. Here with Rory Stewart tonight. Welcome, everybody. We have over 2,000 of you. Over 2,000 different screens, and I think we've probably seen there over 3,000 people. Rory has pointed out that he did do a bigger audience when he addressed the Albert Hall last year, which is some 5,000. But Rory, you had lots of other people there, including Eddie Redmayne on just before you, whereas it is 1 hour mint solo. Rory talking to the audience. Can I particularly welcome those of you who have not joined this series before? We've only got one more before we take a 3 or 4 week pause during August. That's Luke Johnson, the entrepreneur, Patisserie Valerie, the Ivy, Pizza Express, many other activities tomorrow night. Bryony Gordon is going to be there on Thursday. Is now in September. September we've got many glorious speakers, about 30, and then we finish at the end of the month. And can I say also, please have questions ready. We've already had 3 questions in, including one saying Rory from Marcus. So that was anonymous. So have them ready. And also do please pass on details to talk to friends. Now I'm going to just say about Rory that he is clearly one of the most thoughtful, one of the most far-seeing, challenging, courageous, wide-ranging public figures we have in the country, as is evident from his career in administration, politics, government, as a writer, as a campaigner, as a thinker. So, Rory, let's just begin. Welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we always start by asking our guests for the evening to talk about the room that they're in. If this was the Albert Hall, we couldn't see inside your house and your room, but now we can. We have come to you. We're 3,000, rising 3,500 people who have descended on your house. What room are we in? Is this where you work and write things?
Yeah, so I'm sitting at one end of the house where I keep all my books. I wasn't expecting Anthony to do this, but if you're interested, I will move you very quickly to have a look. So you can see here, this is a air hockey set I've been building with my 5-year-old son.
Yeah.
And here is my bookshelf, which gives you a slightly pretentious sense of a lot of philosophy books, and maybe an unrealistic image of me. Did you see that, or did I put my finger over this? I probably put my finger over the camera. Yep.
That clear. Just as of this point, and without, what book in your library has most inspired you?
Wow. I suppose the book that I think is still the most interesting, powerful book is probably Don Quixote. Cervantes' Don Quixote.
Why?
Because I think he has put his finger on the fundamental thing certainly for me, but I think for lots of us, which is the gap between our dreams, our fantasies. In the case of Don Quixote, he wants to be a knight in shining armor. He wants to be one of King Arthur's knights. And the reality, which is that we're lomping around on some old nag and tilting at windmills.
And what is your fantasy? What would be your equivalent to being an Arthurian knight?
Well, I think actually a bit like Don Quixote, I would quite like to be an Arthurian knight. I think that's a very appealing one. But I think 500 years having passed, it's more difficult for me to go lomping around on a donkey.
Well, hang on. I mean, it might still happen. I'm the round table that the King Arthur could well rise up. But let's go back just to that Eton background. Has, on balance, Rory, being an Etonian been more of a hindrance or more of a help? Be honest.
I think it's probably been a help, because I think it gives you obviously a very, very helpful set of relationships, friendships, in jargon terms of network. I think it's obviously an amazing education, and I was very, very lucky to be able to learn as much as I did, read as much as I did, and have such good teachers. I think as a politician, it's probably a bit of a mixed blessing, because of course every time I'm described in the media, I'm described as the old Etonian Rory Stewart, and if I'd gone to another school, I wouldn't have had to stick that in front of my name. And I think it gives an odd impression. It gives the impression that I'm somehow the same person as Jacob Rees-Mogg or Boris Johnson, when I feel that I'm a very different kind of person.
Are you closer to Jacob Rees-Mogg or to Boris Johnson?
I'm not close to either of them, to be honest.
Do you feel instinctively closer to one or the other?
No, I mean, I think both of them, in a sense, suggest to me some of the things I find uncomfortable about the school that I went to. My friends from Eton, the people that I admire and feel close to, were not usually people who would have ever considered going into politics. They're people who've become writers or who have become actors. And
if they're writers and actors, you could mention them by name. They're not private people.
Right, but well, there's a playwright called Stephen Brown who's working on a play for the National at the moment. There's a fantastic comedian called Will Adamsdale, who I love, but they're not super famous old Etonian actors and writers, but they're my closest friends.
Which one teacher most inspired you at Eton, and why?
Yeah, there was a man called Peter Holmes, who was my English master, who was extraordinary. He was so amazingly intense. He would sit there with his head in his hands, sweating over T.S. Eliot or poring over King Lear. And he brought his love of Wittgenstein and his obsession with a particular view of philosophy to bear on this text. And a lot of the other children in the class hated him and got very bored and fed up. And I worshipped him.
Before you went up to Oxford, you spent 5 months, was it, in the Black Watch? Why? Why were you not off smoking but not inhaling substances in Thailand?
I think the answer to that is that I'd spent a lot of time in places like Thailand already. I'd grown up in Hong Kong and Malaysia, and I'd spent a lot of my summers in those places. I think also I'd always wanted to be a soldier. I think I dreamt of being an infantry officer. I was the 4th generation of my family into the Black Watch. And I was expecting to, I went in for my gap year, I was expecting to join again after university. What surprised me wasn't so much that I joined the army when I was 18, but that I didn't join again when I was 22.
And you didn't?
I didn't join again because I think it was a very interesting and peculiar time to be in the army. I joined the army in 1991. The Cold War had ended, and we were still training on fighting Russian tanks, but there were no Russian tanks coming. We had no ammunition. My regiment hadn't been to war since the Korean War. It had fought in Northern Ireland, but whole generations had passed, and you felt like you were rehearsing for a play that was never going to get put on. I could see myself still being in the battalion in 20 years' time, having never done anything. And actually that turned out not to be true, because of course, not long after I left, the Balkans happened, and then Iraq and Afghanistan happened, but that wasn't clear to me in 91.
You went to Balliol, which still had a reputation as being the top Oxford college, and read PPE, which maybe still has a reputation of being the top degree. How did that change you?
Well, I started reading actually history. I did history for my first year and a half and then changed halfway through my second year. I loved the philosophy parts of PPE. I never really understood the politics or economics bits of it. But I did love doing Aristotle. I loved doing Wittgenstein. And I continue, I think, to, when I write or speak or think, to be very influenced by the way that the philosophers who I studied when I was 20 wrote or thought or spoke.
Tell us one way that Wittgenstein has changed your life.
I think Wittgenstein changed my life because he put, for me, an enormous amount of emphasis on forms of life and rules of games and the way in which meaning is embedded in use. And therefore, when I became, for example, a politician, it was very helpful for me to understand the extent to which the only way to make sense of a lot of the peculiar ritual and jargon of politics is that it was, as Wittgenstein said, something whose meaning lay in its use, that you couldn't take it too literally.
Now, your life is absolutely shrouded in a mystery, and was Rory Stewart in MI6 or not? We won't go there, but did you tutor Will and Harry?
I did do that.
What can you tell us about that? How responsible you feel?
So on that, I'm afraid this is, this is my one thing that I don't do really, which is I've not actually taught very much, unlike you. You're a very distinguished teacher, but having only taught 2 people properly, I decided I better keep quiet about my students.
We'll let you off there. Of course, they were very young at the time, weren't they?
Exactly.
Their mother was still 6 years before Diana was killed, if the timing was right. But then when you left Oxford, you went not into the armed forces, but into the Foreign Office, and you worked in, amongst other places, in Tunisia and Montenegro. What was that decision? That it was almost like the army, but more intellectual?
Yeah, exactly. I was looking for some of the same excitement, and it was a very, very exciting time in Indonesia. I arrived, and Indonesia, which had been one of the most stable countries in Southeast Asia for nearly 30 years, just after I arrived, everything exploded. There was this great financial crisis, and by the spring of '98, I found myself in the square with 150,000 students, with people firing plastic bullets at us, with the president being toppled, another president coming in, with East Timor going independent, all of that happening during my time. And it was extraordinary because I realized when I went, and a wise old bird in the Foreign Office said to me, don't believe all these people who tell you there's going to be a revolution in Indonesia. They've been saying that since the early 1980s, and 15 years has passed and it's never happened. But as soon as I arrived, it did.
And then you left the Foreign Office and you went walking. I mean, that's a big deal. To get into the Foreign Office, just to clarify that, was extraordinarily difficult. Even if one had been to Eton and Oxford, maybe it was beginning to be the time where it was getting more difficult if one had that background. And you quit that and you went walking for a long time and you wrote your first book. What was in your mind?
I was deeply, I think, obsessed with the idea of getting out into the world. And by that, I really meant into the countryside of the world, putting my feet across as much of the surface of the planet as I could, walking around it and staying in people's houses. I walked for 21 months. I stayed in, I think, 550 different village houses along the walk in Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan.
Describe the cogitative process about leaving, where the genesis of the walk came from and what the route was. How far had you planned the route in advance?
I had the idea at that stage of walking all the way around the world. So I thought what I'll do is I'll start walking in Turkey, and I'll walk from Turkey to the coast of Vietnam, then I'll walk across South America, and then I'll walk from Portugal back to Turkey again. Obviously, I would have had to get on some boats to get across the Pacific and the Atlantic. What happened in the end is that I only did the Asian leg of the walk. I didn't do the South American or European bits.
Yeah.
I hadn't planned. Well, sorry, I had planned, but there were bits that went very wrong. I mean, one of the problems was that I couldn't initially get across Afghanistan because I was trying to enter Afghanistan when the Taliban was still there. So I was only able to walk across Afghanistan after the Taliban fell. I came in about a week and a half after the Taliban government had fallen, and then walked from Herat to Kabul. I also had problems walking through Western Pakistan, through Baluchistan, because the Pakistan government wouldn't let me. I was arrested in Iran a number of times and finally thrown out. So it was difficult to stick. And then finally, I think I completely underestimated how hot it is in India. This sounds a daft thing to say, but I completely underestimated how hot it was walking in April, May, and June. So I completely changed my route and headed up into the Himalayas, and spent the next 8 months walking along the Himalayas and then trekking across Nepal, when I was actually expecting to walk across the Indian plain.
And this came out of your first book, Places in Between, that became a New York Times bestseller and bestseller far and wide. I don't think I've yet understood what you were trying to do. I understand you wanted to walk around the world, but why would you pick up a career in the Foreign Office? Why would you put yourself at so much pain and risk, physical risk and danger? And who inspired you? Which travel writers, for example, inspired you?
I was very inspired, oddly, by a travel writer who I really don't like, called Bruce Chapman. So ironically, he infuriates me. His writing style infuriates me, but I was completely seduced by his idea of the songlines, his idea that Aboriginal people in Australia created myths by walking and related to the world through walking, and that mystics meditated through walking, and that Wordsworth composed poems walking. He convinced me that walking was the most powerful sort of spiritual experience. And so I really did it. I mean, remember, it's an embarrassing thing to talk about. I mean, I was, I suppose, 26 when I did it. But at the time, I think it was a sort of existential thing, a mystical desire. I thought that if I walked all the way around the world, I would become more fully a human being. I'd understand the world more. I felt that the analogy I used at the time, as I said, I felt that I was as though I had been born in a prison cell, and that I needed to walk around the walls of that prison cell, and that prison cell was the world.
Doesn't seem at all strange to me, that mystical quest. What's happened to your sense of mysticism and spiritual dimensions? Did you still have that?
At the end of the walk, I had become quite a silent person, because I hadn't spoken to many people in 21 months, except in the evenings when I would speak. But often in the evenings, of course, I was speaking or trying to speak in Dari or Urdu or Nepali, and I didn't speak those languages very well. So I remember returning, and my friend Will, who I was talking about, the comedians, saying that for about 2 weeks I seemed like this very distant figure. And then 2 weeks later, he said I sort of reverted to whatever I was before I went on the walk. This sort of profound mystical sense of myself, at least on the surface, didn't last very long.
As somebody who spent my life amongst predominantly young people, I'm always struck by how there's a sense of a mystical ideal and quest that so many young people have, which the process of jobs and mortgages and bank accounts and pensions irons out of them. But it's just the crud of life taking over from the deep mystical search. Do you still have that, is my question?
Yes, but you're right. It becomes much more difficult as you get older to sustain. So I have last year I spent 11 days in silent meditation, and 3 years ago I did the same thing. So that's
on
11.
a Zen retreat.
Yeah, it's a Vipassana retreat, exactly. So you meditate. You wake up at 4 in the morning and you meditate from almost continually in silence from 4 in the morning till 9:30 at night, and you don't speak for 10 days.
Would you recommend that?
Yes, very much, very much, very much, and I think in a way one of the things that I'm struggling with now that I'm trying to work out what to do as I leave politics, is to work out whether I can again throw off some of what you call the sort of crud of life and get back to the things that I am passionate about and that I love, and how you balance that with having a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old and a family and all those kind of obligations.
Well, that's the great quest of life, isn't it? And so many will come onto this. Politicians lead lives in power when they have power, which are so ill-attuned with their deepest, most fundamental beliefs. They then try and square that in their memoirs, but deep down they recognise that they are out of kilter with what has their deepest song within them is, in Thoreau's terms. But let's just carry on just walking through the life. The book, how did that change you? Did you want to become a writer? And then how did you become deputy governor in Iraq?
So becoming deputy governor in Iraq happened in this room where you're interviewing me. I was sitting in this room in 2003, and I remember seeing Saddam's statue coming down. And although I had taken 2 years to walk, I was still technically on the Foreign Office's books. I was on something called supplementary unpaid leave. So when they were looking for somebody to go to Iraq, I think they didn't find as many volunteers as they wanted. So when I said I was prepared to go, in this room, I had email exchange and telephone call, and they began discussing what I could do. But they then went silent for a few weeks. So I thought, well, forget that. I'll just go to Baghdad. So I flew to Jordan and took a taxi and turned up in Baghdad, drove through Fallujah, which at that time was a pretty strange place because there was a lot of kidnapping on the road, a lot of people driving around very fast with big heavy machine guns on the back of trucks. And I remember turning up there and seeing the director of operations, who explained to me that most of the staff they were trying to employ was still stuck in the airport. They couldn't move them 1.5 miles from the airport to the headquarters because they were worried about IEDs and security. So he said to me, since you've bothered to turn up, I'll give you a job. And at that point, a friend gave me the best bit of advice I've received, which was to say, don't take a job in headquarters, take a job in the field. So I turned down a more senior job in Baghdad to instead take a job right out in this very obscure province in the Marsh Arab region of southern Iraq called Al-Amara, where I ended up as the deputy governor, but there was no governor. So for the first few weeks, I was entirely in charge of a province of, I guess, 650,000 people, and then moved to Nasiriyah, where there were almost 2 million people.
A sense there guided. Most people, Rory, would not do that with their lives. They wouldn't put themselves at that degree of risk, and they wouldn't have the self-confidence to go into the heart of a war zone and to pitch up and then take a job like that. This sense you understand deep inside you forces shaping your decisions and choices that you make.
I'm not sure I'm very good at explaining why I do things or what my motivations are, but I suppose my father had been a Black Watch officer during the war. He'd then been a Malayan civil servant during the Malayan emergency, driving around with a gun on his dashboard, fighting a communist insurgency. He'd then been in MI6 and ended up as the deputy head of the Secret Service and had served all over Asia, including being popped into a miniature submarine off the coast of Borneo. And a combination of that father and the sort of books that I read as a child left me feeling this was exactly the sort of thing I was supposed to do. I didn't suppose I questioned it very much.
And just mention the books that you had read as a child, just 2 or 3 authors.
Well, they're great cliches. I mean, I read very seriously and repeatedly T. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom and biographies of Lawrence. And I realized that was something that was partly put into my head by my father, who I remember whenever we complained in Malaya that we were feeling thirsty, he would say, Lawrence of Arabia went for 4 days in the desert without drinking. And that was always the response. So held up for me. I was fascinated by Alexander the Great and read a lot of biographies of Alexander the Great. I mean, these were Alexander Burns, who Road to Bukhara. It's a great book that I enjoyed enormously when I was 20, called The Great Game by Peter Hopkirk, which described a lot of these strange British officers on the northwest frontier in the 19th century.
Yeah. So Iraq, that time came to an end. Why your decision to come out of that? And then the tortoise, tell us about how that came up in Afghanistan.
Right. Okay. So I came to the end of my time in Iraq because we handed over to the Iraqi government. There was a flag came down, handover ceremony, and I was then lobbying, I think, to be the British ambassador to Belarus. I was very keen on going to Belarus. I'd convinced myself that Belarus was the future and that it was this last dictatorship on the edge of the European Union. And this is 2004. I was absolutely convinced it was about to, go through a democratic revolution. That was a serious miscalculation. I still would have been there. Still would have been there 16 years later, still waiting for this to happen. So I then was asked to go to Kabul to look at the possibility of setting up an art school. And I went out there as a favor at the end of 2005 and completely fell in love with a part of the old city which was due to be demolished. So there were 2 completely separate things. The thing I'd been asked to do, which was to do a feasibility study on setting up an art school, and the thing that I fell in love with, which was this whole part of the old city, these wonderful courtyard buildings in this community that was about to be bulldozed. And it struck me that if I put the art school in the center of this part of the old city, I could do both at the same time. But I wasn't sure this was really my life. I mean, I came back and gave a little report. I was really going out as a consultant and said, well, look, this is what somebody could do. And then I was asked if I'd go and set it up. So I went out, and again, I was unpaid. I was an unpaid volunteer, and I arrived and I turned my driver into my logistics manager, and I'd hired about 120 people within the first, I think, 3.5 months. And we began going with a carpentry school, calligraphy school. And as we got going, eventually we built a clinic, we built a primary school, we restored 120 buildings, we did all the water supply, we did the whole sewerage, employing everybody directly ourselves under these mud buildings, and began getting floods of volunteers in. So we moved into a huge mud fort above the old city of Kabul and ran it as a series of sort of dormitories where we all ate together, and there were Australian architects, Indian engineers, Polish engineers, ceramicists, all coming out, and it was probably the most fulfilling, exciting thing I'd ever done, and it was the place I met my wife.
Tell us about that and the impact on your life and your sense of your own personal safety and stability.
So the great thing for me was that Shoshana came out initially as a volunteer, and we worked together for 2 years, and I felt that she was seeing me at 3 years, I suppose, seeing me at my very, very best, and I was seeing her at her best. And we went through some, as you can imagine, in Afghanistan, which was a war zone. This is right at the height of the fighting in Helmand. There were a lot of difficult things, as well as all the warmth and generosity and comedy of what was going on in the old city of Kabul. We were having to deal with security threats. We were having to deal with the money for the charity running out. We were having to work out ridiculous logistics. You know, how on earth do you build a sewage line that doesn't get destroyed by rocket fire? And we were doing it together. And what I loved about it, and this is partly about setting up your own thing and being a sort of entrepreneur, is that all our values, what we believed in, could go into everything, go into the way that you manage staff, go into the way that you built the institution, go into the rules and regulations, go into how much paperwork you do, go into how you sequence things. None of these things are possible in a big bureaucracy where when you inherit something, building something is much, much more fun. And I think through that, I found her. Later, though, I mean, we didn't start to actually go out for 5 years, but she had become my very closest friend through that.
What's that like, going out with your closest friend? And what was it about Shoshana that really captivated you?
Oh, I think seeing her extraordinary, initially it was seeing her extraordinary ability in Kabul. Her ability to be totally calm and unflummoxed by the most extraordinary, difficult, challenging, crazy situations. Her ability to go straight out into the old city of Kabul and talk very gentle and beautiful diary to people to calm them down. Her willingness to get on a plane at a moment's notice to Pondicherry to look at sewage lines. But fundamentally, her courage.
How does that translate into the life of living in West London and nappies and taxis and bedtimes and the rest? How does your life keep that burning sense of being at the margin of life into the prosaic nature, your poetry life into the prose of everyday life?
I think that's difficult. I think that is difficult. I think we were very lucky over the last few years in London. I think we had a lovely life and we were very blessed with our children. But I think both of us miss Afghanistan, and both of us at a very large level would love to move back to the developing world and to set up another similar project again, because I think it's very difficult in Britain or the United States or Europe to have that degree of challenge and excitement and experience that we found, at least working in Afghanistan.
I don't know how many listeners to this, viewers, will themselves recognize in your own lives that there are things that you did. Maybe you went on a gap year before university and were involved in development work, working with people where somehow life seems to be much more alive, vivid. The colours are brighter, the sounds are crisper and clearer, and the emotion is much more real. You came out of that, and your second book had happened, Occupational Hazards. And you became an MP to Penrith in 2010. We're going to accelerate. There are lots of questions coming up. But what was the quest about? Penrith, that gave you mountains and lakes.
Well, I did. It was very easy to fall in love with my constituency, and I did throughout the whole thing. The one thing that was very precious was that relationship with the constituency, because it's the largest, most sparsely populated constituency in England. It's surrounded by a ring of mountains. It's just stunningly beautiful, and particularly the farming communities in Penrith I became very close to, and I developed so much, I suppose, affection and love particularly for people who farm sheep and cows.
And what was the game plan here? You were going to go on and become Prime Minister. You stood to become Prime Minister 9 years later. You came fifth, which is pretty close. You were only 4 people off becoming the most powerful person in Britain. Just tell us which of the various ministerial jobs you had made the most impact on you.
The one that I loved most was being prisons minister.
Why?
Because I really felt I could make a difference, and I loved that job. Firstly, it was a scandal. It was shocking, the state of the prisons. Violence had tripled in 5 years. There were 32,000 assaults a year. The suicide rates were terrifying. I mean, and people, I would turn up and find people locked 2 to a cell, in a cell the Victorians built for 1. In Birmingham, there was blood on the floor. In Liverpool, all the windows were smashed. I mean, it was a truly terrifying crisis. And I very quickly developed a deep affection for prison officers, for prisoners, and a real interest in it, and was able quite quickly, for once, to understand what needed to be done, which is that we needed to make prisons safe for prison officers, safe for prisons, safe for families. And that, I think, is the real trick in politics, which is to see something quite simple and straightforward and be able to express it in that way. A lot of thinking goes on, but when you get to the point where you can say to people, this is about making people safe, you've got that.
Is everybody redeemable?
Is everybody redeemable?
Your sense of prisoners, does evil?
I think almost everybody's redeemable. Yeah, I think most of the prisoners I met were unfortunate human beings. They'd also imposed extraordinary misery on the public, so we also have to have some compassion for the public too. But remember that 50% of the people I worked with in prison had reading ages under 11. 60% of them had drug and alcohol dependencies. About a third of them had been in care or excluded from school, another third excluded from school. So it's a pretty, they of course impose misery on people, but they are themselves also victims.
When we went for a long walk along the River Thames, when you were thinking about being Mayor of London, it was clear to me that the experience in prisons had been very formative. How would you have used that to have shaped what you might have done as Mayor of London?
I think I would have begun by taking some of my experience of working with prison officers to working with the Metropolitan Police. And the big insight there is that it's about getting behind the people on the front line, and not just talking about that, but actually in prisons, walking the landings. With the police, I would have become a special constable, and I would have gone out on patrol with them regularly. And I would have put the emphasis on community policing. I think the danger in many modern bureaucracies is that all the status or the rewards goes to people in fancy specialist jobs, often non-uniform specialist jobs, which in the prison service could be a range of things, and in the police could be, being a detective or something. But I believe that the core of these organizations are the frontline uniformed staff, and getting behind them and rewarding them and encourage them to feel that their jobs are worthwhile.
Is there a space in politics, Rory, for somebody like you who has been in war zones, seen human depravity very close up, who has walked some of the globe month after month and lived in a very, very basic way? Wouldn't it be better just to have people who'd come out of university and gone into political consultancies and special advisors jobs? Because that's the way it's looking, isn't it? Those people with broad backgrounds, where are they? Where are they in Boris Johnson's cabinet?
So I think it's a double-edged question, that, because of course I'm tempted to say that we need more people with broader backgrounds, but I realized when I was there how much I lacked by coming in late. So I had not been a university politician. I'd not been a member of the Conservative Party because I'd been a civil servant. I'd been briefly actually a member of the Labour Party when I was 18, and then I hadn't been involved in politics at all. And so entering the House of Commons for the first time, aged whatever I was, 36, I was coming into a world in which everybody else knew each other incredibly well. even if they were younger than me, they had been in the system, going to those party conferences, campaigning each other's constituencies. They knew all the history. They knew who Dominic Cummings was because he'd been Ian Duncan Smith's, head of strategy in 2005, and these kind of things that I didn't know at all. And that is a huge disadvantage because it is a tribe, and politics is very, very tribal. And if you don't have a very tribal sense, and I don't, I came into it, I'm afraid, thinking too much like a civil servant. I thought, well, here I am, I've done these different things, and maybe I can bring my experience to bear, and maybe I could be a Foreign Office minister or something. And I speak some languages. I've spent 10 years living in the Middle East and Asia. I've written some books, so maybe I could be a good Foreign Office minister. I was missing the point that the point of politics is a great deal of it seems to be tribal. And the disadvantage of coming in as I did, my apologies, the cat. The disadvantage of my coming in as I did is that I end up, slightly out of the loop, not really understanding the unspoken rules, not really understanding, not understanding the rules of the game at all. I mean, for example, I rebelled on a whip, and George Osborne told me that he was about to promote me, and if I rebelled, he wouldn't promote me for the next 4 years. And it just seemed inconceivable to me. I mean, in what kind of job would you, either he thinks I'm valuable or not, but not promoting me for 4 years on a single vote seemed to be completely mad. It was the Constitution. They wanted to abolish the House of Lords in exchange for the Lib Dems backing them on redrawing the constituency boundaries, because they thought if they could redraw the boundaries, they could do better at the next election. And I didn't think you should change the Constitution like that. And I'd spent 4 months telling them, very politely, I wasn't doing anything in the press, that I couldn't go along with that and I couldn't vote for it. And then 5 minutes before the vote, George Osborne stopped me at the door of the lobby and said, if you walk through that door, I'm not going to promote you for 4 years.
Notice George Osborne was saying, I'm not going to promote you. He wasn't the Prime Minister. Mind you, Dominic Cummings isn't the Prime Minister either, is he? And which would you sooner have been, Prime Minister or Mayor of London?
Mayor of London, I think. I would have loved to be Mayor of London. I very, very much regret not being Mayor of London. I think if I'd been lucky enough to do that, I think I love the intimacy of mayoral jobs. I love the fact that you're connecting with the things that the public really care about. One of the frustrations as a politician is that so many of the things the public care about, which are direct, policing, safety, transport, are not the job of the Prime Minister. They're the job of your local mayor. And I'd love that direct connection. I think London is an extraordinary city. So I think if I have a regret in life, it will be that I wasn't able to become Mayor of London, not that I wasn't able to be Prime Minister.
But you might still be. This is such a pivotal moment in your life. Picking up a question here from Chris Brockbank, who's a mature student at the University of Buckingham, asks how, Rory, you managed, what was the knack of gaining the confidence of populations and their elders? How did you gain their trust?
How did I gain the trust of elders when walking?
And I think also in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, I think the central thing is always respect. Now that begins with politeness, but it's more than politeness. It's being able, giving the impression that you care and that you admire people and that you're interested in the details of their lives. And sometimes, oddly, that can involve being challenging. I think in the end, people will forgive you being challenging if they think that you care and that you're actually absorbed and that you're interested.
Manyara, different question, asks about the merging of DFID and the FCO, and do you think that's going to help develop?
No, I don't think the merging of the FCO and DFID is very helpful. They're very different jobs. DFID is a very specialist job. They will be doing a $300 million education program in Ethiopia with the World Bank and all these other stakeholders, and it's a sort of project management role. It has very little to do with what diplomacy is about, which is basically politics and relationships. And I think it's a mistake to put people with completely different skill sets and totally different objectives under the same management structures.
Natasha's asking, she's saying, thank you for speaking to us tonight, Rory. What do you think were the gains of Western intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq? And by the way, coming up early in September is 9/11, and we have Angie Hunter, who was in Tony Blair's team, who'll be talking about what happened that day, how they heard their news, how they responded. You know, I mean, here we are, 19 years on from 9/11. Is Afghanistan in a better place because of Western intervention? Is Iraq?
Broadly speaking, the answer is no. I mean, there have been changes, and we can keep talking about them. Many more girls have gone to school, many more roads have been built. But if you compare the amount that was spent, I mean, these were literally trillion-dollar wars, with the deployment of over 100,000 US, UK, and other coalition soldiers at any one time. In each country, spending over $100 billion a year, very, very little was achieved. And I think we will see those interventions as being the very end of 2 decades of intervention. And what they revealed is that we simply do not have the knowledge, the power, or the legitimacy to engage in that kind of nation building under fire.
Did we fall into the trap that Osama bin Laden laid for the West?
Yes, to some extent. I mean, on the other hand, it didn't quite work out in the way that he expected. He was assuming that we would be broken in the way that he believed the Soviet Union had been broken on Afghanistan. I'm going to let this cat out, otherwise he's going to cause fury. So sorry.
Time there.
Here we are. That's a tiny, small bit of comedy with the cat. The cat, of course, now that I've opened the door, the cat has no interest in leaving. So
we have the university cat here called Dennis, who is a professor of feline studies. Dennis is a black cat. Anyway, but back to Osama bin Laden.
So bin Laden, thought that his role in fighting the Soviet Union had led to the fall of the Soviet Union, and he, I think, fantasized that somehow our intervention in Afghanistan would lead to the fall of the United States and the coalition powers. That, of course, was not true. It was a massively costly in lives and in money, and was in many ways a humiliation. But it wasn't what Osama bin Laden thought, which is a sort of the end of a whole civilization.
Question here, is the world a better place without Osama bin Laden alive?
Yes.
Hock Chu is taking us in a different direction. Were you surprised, given what you said, that George Osborne backed you when he was mayor of the Evening Standard when he was editor of the Evening Standard to be mayor of London?
I'm a little surprised, but actually, to be honest, I've become very fond of him. I mean, he is an incredibly intelligent person. He's very, very good company. He's very funny, and I've come to understand his character more. I now understand it's completely in his character to not promote somebody for 4 years because they don't do what they say. So I think, I mean, I have grown to sort of like him.
2 questions here on China. Where do you stand on China? Is there going to be a new Cold War between the West and China? China taking the place of the Soviet Union, and is the West fundamentally mishandling Xi in China?
I think there is likely to be an equivalent of a Cold War with China. I think it's inevitable. I think, despite people's hopes over the last 15 years, the West and China have not managed to find the right balance in a global system. These mechanisms like the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, which we had somehow hoped, and indeed liberal market economies, which we'd somehow hoped would bring everybody together so that it would be a continuation of the world of the 1990s and 2000s turned out not really to be true. And I think China remains a highly nationalistic power, and I think it's not very interested in liberal balance of power.
So what should the successor to Trump, is Trump going to win in November in the US election, and what should the successor do with China?
I've really found out that predicting election results is a real mug's game. I've seen some of my most intelligent, distinguished friends who are, know a hell of a lot about these things, getting this stuff wrong again and again and again. I was very struck how every time I went into an election 6 weeks before the election, people like George Osborne or Michael Gove, who really study this stuff very, very closely, were never quite able to predict what was going to happen even 6 weeks out, let alone 6 months out. Or sorry, not 6 months out, 5 months out. I think that, however, I think it's perfectly plausible that Trump could win the election. And I think even were Biden to win the election, we're going to end up in a world in which the US will be much, much more skeptical towards China. And that is an increasing consensus with senators and congressmen from every bent in the States.
And will there be war? If there is war, will it be nuclear?
I don't think there's likely to be nuclear war. But again, the odd thing about wars is that they can often happen very, very, very quickly and very unpredictably. I mean, as we all know, I mean, at the end of 1913, it would have seemed completely inconceivable that everybody was going to end up in the First World War.
A lot of people want you to come back into politics, and one person wants you to become the Vice Chancellor of the University of Buckingham. So there you are, Rory. Mark is asking, how can we, is there a bright future for young people wanting to get into politics? How can we restore confidence, trust in politics when we have people in number 10 who seem to have such disdain for ministers and indeed their own MPs?
I think it's very difficult. I mean, it's a very, very difficult balance, this, because on the one hand, it's the only politics we've got. It's the only democracy we've got. And none of us is any good at thinking up a particularly good alternative. And it isn't fundamentally a constitutional problem. I don't think we can fix it just with proportional representation or some new design of parliament. I think it's a question of our whole culture and our characters. To be pretentious, probably our virtues, and the way that we all, voters, journalists, politicians, interact with each other, and what we let politicians get away with or not. So let's take Boris Johnson, for example. Has anybody, really thought through whether the journalists, or indeed the other members of Parliament, fully convinced themselves that Boris was the best person to be Prime Minister? Or was it simply that they thought that he was most likely to win an election? I mean, this is what I couldn't quite work out, and this was very personal to me because I was running against him in the leadership. And frequently, friends of mine would end up supporting him, who I thought were going to support me. And very rarely did they say it was because they thought that he had better policies or that they thought he would be able to make better decisions. It simply came down to the question of winning. They thought that he was more likely to win than I was. And that then goes to the whole question of why he's more likely to win and what it is about the public and journalists and things which make certain characters more likely to win than others. But if you're a young person going into politics, you're going to have to answer all those questions in a way that I'm failing to at the moment.
Billy is asking, had you become Prime Minister, how would you be handling the coronavirus? Would you be handling it differently?
Well, I was very outspoken at the end of February, and I believe very strongly that we should have been locking down immediately and that we should have been copying initially, if we could have done, South Korea on test and trace, and that the correct response was to be criticised for acting too quickly rather than too slowly, and that if you lock down fast and quick and got your testing and tracing right, then you'd be able to open up your economy more quickly and, if necessary, shut it down again. And those were big disagreements. I mean, I found myself up against the chief scientific officer, the chief medical officer, and indeed the health secretary and others. All those people felt very, very strongly that that I was overreacting, that we didn't need to move that quickly, that this was a disease that was much more like the flu. These are difficult choices, but yeah, that's what I was calling for, and that's what I think I would have done as Prime Minister.
You talked about this before. Had you become Prime Minister, your family life, your children, Shoshana, everything that you experienced would have been changed and made much more dangerous, much more edgy. The prism that the Prime Minister goes through changes and distorts family life. Would you have really wanted that? Would it be a price worth paying?
I think it would have been very difficult. I think probably in the end you have to feel that being Prime Minister must be a price worth paying, because it is such an extraordinary role and it's such an important responsibility of the country. But you're absolutely right. I think it's deeply destructive to mind, to body, to soul, to family, and it leaves you a very, very battered person at the end of it. And I think people almost never recover from the role.
Absolutely. Most prime ministers fail. Many of their children have gone on and had terrible lives, and many of their marriages have suffered enormously. A question now about Brexit. I understand, Rory, that you were not keen on Brexit, but now do you not think that this is right for Britain, and are you optimistic that the benefits will in fact accrue?
Well, I obviously campaigned hard for Remain, and then I decided after the referendum that what we needed was a soft Brexit. And partly one of the reasons we need soft Brexit is, along with all the other economic arguments, I think we needed to bring the country together. We didn't need to be faced with a choice between a no-deal Brexit on the one hand and Remain on the other, that we could compromise. And I thought we could compromise maybe around a customs union, sort of thing we had, the European Union has with Turkey. I lost that argument in a very, very big and dramatic fashion. And in the end, a lot of my colleagues in Parliament who, like me, I think, were against a no-deal Brexit, are now going down a path which looks, at the moment, as though it's going to end up in a no-deal Brexit. I mean, I may be wrong again. The European Union is difficult to predict. Am I optimistic about that? Look, I think Britain is an extraordinary country with extraordinary strengths and wonderful people in it. But boy, are we damaging ourselves? I mean, these are unnecessary. The combination of what coronavirus is doing to us and what Brexit is doing to us is going to knock us back. And not fatally, I think we remain an extraordinary place. But remember, Britain had a difficult time in the late 60s, 1970s. People were not, we were in many ways the same people, but it was not a good moment for us. And that can return again. And we need to not assume that, the experience that we had from the mid-80s to 2008 is the norm.
There is so I can pick up. Diana says, we want you to go back into politics. Are you going to do that?
I think it's extremely unlikely as of this moment. I think that I'm not sure that I'm not sure I'm very suited to it. I'm not sure I can contribute very well. I think I'm good in a niche role. I think I was a pretty good prisons minister, but I'm not sure I really enjoy enough the cut and thrust, the tribal stuff, the Yabu sucks in Parliament, or indeed the whole culture of it. And I think if you don't enjoy a whole aspect of the job, then it's difficult to do it well.
The bell is about to chime behind you. In 2008, Brad Pitt bought the rights to your life in a film. Who would you like to have played Rory Stewart?
So I'm very, very keen on Danny DeVito.
Because?
I think he's got the glamour, the looks. I think he's exactly who I want to be represented by.
Okay, and to conclude, we're going to be giving you one piece of music which we haven't touched on. What piece of music would you most like?
Oh gosh, okay. I'd like a bagpipe tune. It's a Highland marching tune called "The Black Bear."
The Black Bear, and we're not going to ask you about a book. We've done that. One animal to live with you on your mountaintop rather than desert island.
I'd like a lemur. I'd like a ring-tailed lemur.
Called?
If there's lemur, it would have to be called Leonard.
So there you are. With Leonard and the bagpipe music, we're going to leave you there with White Cat. Rory, from all of us, it's been an extraordinarily truthful and stimulating. It's made me think a lot. It begs for me, the leaving question is making us reflect on our own lives and what really is important to us, and how can we lead our own lives attuned to what is deepest within us, and how easily, without us admitting it, that can be covered up by the everyday necessities. Rory Stewart, thank you very much from all of us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much.